Welcome back, everyone. It's Uriah Young from the 50, 40, 90 interview series from Basketball Now and Then. Today's guest is Larry Schechter, acclaimed fantasy sports historian and author of The History of Fantasy Sports, the definitive look into how a niche hobby grew into a global phenomenon. Welcome to the show, Larry.
Thanks for having me.
So, Larry, let me ask you this. Fantasy's been around for a while. Baseball, fantasy football, fantasy basketball. What convinced you that the history of fantasy sports deserved an entire book?
Well, I've played fantasy sports since the early 1990s, and I, for several years, like going back maybe 10 years ago, roughly, I would look at what's happened to fantasy sports and how it's grown absurdly. You got millions and millions of people playing all over the world, all different kinds of sports. You got 24/7 Sirius XM radio station for fantasy sports. When you're watching games now, they talk about fantasy. It's become a, $25 billion global industry. So for a long time, going back 10 years ago, give or take, I would look at this like, how did this all happen? How did we go from these ideas people had years ago for games to where it is now? And nobody has ever written a book about the history. Nobody has ever explained how it happened. You could, Google, get, bits and pieces of it. And so I just knew for a long time, somebody should write a book about this. And I decided to do it. I wrote a book in 2014. I wrote Winning Fantasy Baseball, which was an Amazon bestseller. And, after that, I would think sometimes, is there some other book that I might want to write? And, this was the the only idea I ever had, because I knew it was needed. So that's how it happened. And there's no other book like it that tells, how we went from this. The book covers everything. It goes back to precursors of fantasy sports to modern day fantasy sports. And when I say modern day fantasy sports, the distinction for me is, before modern fantasy sports, there were games you could play, but they were based on athletes' past performances. So you could play something like Stratomatic that's based on real Major League Baseball players, NBA players, but it's based on prior year's performance. Whereas what I'm referring to as modern fantasy sports is something that hasn't happened yet. So you draft it for football or basketball now, and then when the season unfolds, that you're getting statistics based on that. So it goes through the precursors of fantasy sports to the invention and spread of fantasy football, the invention and spread of fantasy baseball, other sports, basketball, hockey, etc. The first publications, the first media, Fantasy Sports Trade Association, legal issues, right through there's several chapters on different things, through more modern things like daily fantasy sports and worldwide expansion.
Now, you interviewed many of the pioneers who built this industry. Which conversation with any of those interviewees changed your understanding of how fantasy sports really took off?
Well, there were many. I mean, I did not know hardly anything about any of this when I started, and most people, even people who've been in the industry for a long time, didn't know hardly any of this. In fact, Paul Charchian was the president of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association from 2009 to 21. And he read the book and he said, I've been in industry my whole life. I was the head of the FSTA for 12 years, and I did not know most of what's in this book. One of the, so there were just like several highlights. One of them was I interviewed dozens and dozens of people, and I did tons and tons of research. It took 18 months of full-time work. And, one of the highlights was Dan Okrent, who's credited with inventing fantasy baseball. But there's a whole myth about how he invented it. There was a 30 for 30 ESPN show about it that's completely inaccurate. It basically gives the idea he magically invented the idea on an airplane trip, which is not at all true. It goes back years before that.
So were there any other misconceptions that people might have about how fantasy sports began, other than the airline myth? Anything else stand out to you?
I don't know if there were really, probably not misconceptions, just a lack of knowledge.
Right.
about how it all happened. Like fantasy football goes back to 1963. Bill Winkenbach was a part owner of the Raiders, and he in like the late 50s, he had a very primitive fantasy game for golf and for baseball. And he mentioned it to a writer for the Oakland Tribune. And the guy was like, "Hey, this is great. We should do this for football." And they're like, and that's how it started. And so they had the first fantasy football league in 63. And one of the original members was a guy named Andy Musolinas, who owned a bar in Oakland. And after a couple of years, he got the idea, I think this would be good for business. I think this would be fun and good for business if I offer fantasy football to the patrons at my bar. So he started a league. There was, a lot of interest. He started a league. The next year went to 2 leagues, then 3 leagues, then the first women's league. And so he's the guy that really started spreading fantasy football. Winkenbach is the guy that really invented it, but he kept it kind of just a small private league. Musolimus is the guy who spread it. And, I Googled article after article after article about all this, to where I was reading the same stuff. 95% of what I was reading, I had already read 20 times. Then, like on the 30th or so article that I Google, I see something I'd never seen before, which is Andy Musolinas, besides owning a bar and spreading fantasy football, he was a World War II hero. When he was 17 was when Pearl Harbor happened. And he volunteered, for the Army, and he volunteered for a special forces unit where the recruiter said 97% of you are not going to return alive.
Wow.
And he volunteered anyway. And he was sent behind enemy lines, and he was given a cyanide tablet. So if he got caught by the Germans, he could kill himself. And obviously he survived. And he was a hero. He did things behind enemy lines, to really mess up the Germans, let's just say.
Wow.
And he was a war hero. And and what he did was all classified. And like 50 or so years later, it was finally all unclassified what he did. And he was invited to Washington to receive a Medal of Honor, and he was like the lone surviving member of his unit. Either a lot of them were killed in the war, and then even the people that weren't killed in the war had already died, because by the time he went for this Medal of Honor, he was in his 90s.
Wow. That's fascinating.
What happened is, when I started this whole thing, I had the idea, the history of fantasy sports, who did what, when, how did it all happen? And when I started the research and interviewing people, I just heard all these fascinating things, like about what I just said about Musolinas, and one after another, like a guy who was on his honeymoon in a hotel in the World Trade Center on 9/11. And what happened to him and his wife, the way they escaped the World Trade Center and survived, is like an amazing story. And it's in the book, not just because it's this amazing story, but because it had a direct effect on what led him to get into the fantasy industry. He's now, a major player in the fantasy industry. And because of that experience, actually ended up leading him into the fantasy industry. And, there's just, one fascinating thing after another. So what happened is, early on, I realized I can write a book about the history of fantasy sports, who did what, when, and it would get the job done. It would also come off as a very boring research paper. But by telling these stories to all these people, instead of being boring, it would be really interesting. And so I added a subtitle to the book. The book is called The History of Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People That Made It Happen. And by doing that, the book turned out fantastic. It's, the reviews are great. It's easy to read. It's fascinating. The Midwest Book Review was done by a guy who's never played fantasy sports, and he said it's fascinating from start to finish.
What I want to do is get your opinion about the impact that fantasy sports is currently having on the landscape. So do you feel as though fantasy sports has strengthened the fans' connection to sports, or do you think that it may have shifted the attention away from the teams themselves?
Well, more the first than the second. They're both correct, but it's more the first because, people play fantasy sports. They do, follow their players and not as much the teams. But people tend to still like their teams. If you're a Phillies fan or whatever, you still like the Phillies. And but the people who play fantasy are more into it. You
Yes.
know, this goes back years ago where, I mean, way back, when fantasies first started becoming, known a little bit, like in baseball, for example, in 1981, after Dan Okrent kind of invented what is considered modern fantasy, the the format for fantasy baseball, started to become popular. And at the time, there was this huge divide, like with Major League Baseball writers. By about 81 or so, there was a fantasy baseball league in almost every press box in Major League Baseball cities. And half of the writers loved it, and the other half thought this is terrible, this is horrible, this is going to ruin the game because people are going to root for players instead of their teams.
Hmm.
And, a little bit that's happened. People root for the players one thing, but people still like their teams. The other big thing, though, is that they did a study, at a later date where they found, who's buying the NFL TV packages, who's buying more of the merchandise, who's buying the NBA jerseys. And, it's the fantasy players by like 3-1 or something. We're, watching more games, buying more merchandise, more TV. So it really helped. It took a long time for like the NFL, the MLB, the NBA, the Players Associations. It took them a long time to figure out fantasy was actually a good thing for them, not a bad thing.
But it definitely helps those profit margins. I have to ask you this because in your book, there are a lot of details, expected or unexpected, that pop up on your behalf as the writer. My question to you is, with the fantasy sports industry surviving legal challenges, technological changes, and the shifting of fan habits, as you were alluding to just a moment ago, what do you think was the biggest obstacle that fantasy sports had to overcome?
Well, there were a couple of them. The biggest one, and the first one, was fantasy sports gambling.
Mm.
Most people from the beginning has some kind of prize money involved. In fact, this goes back to the very beginning. Andy Mussolini's starting a league in his bar. They had money involved. They had something called a 10-cent league. Like the first year, like everybody playing 10 cents. If we're in Andy Mussolini's league of 10 people, if my guy scores a touchdown, I get 10 cents from everybody else in the league. So I get 90 cents, something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
And but instead of calling it 10 cents, they called it 10 points because they weren't sure if maybe one day the Vice Squad would bust in and start them a game. And there were a couple incidents where people were charged with gambling. There was in Austin, Texas, and Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a couple of private leagues I think it was the 80s. I'm not sure offhand. I think it was the 80s. They were arrested and charged with gambling. And then it's also been, this big thing in terms of the government, deeming is it gambling or not. So this is something that was like unsettled for many, many years. Finally, it kind of got settled where the federal government said, okay, fantasy sports is not gambling. The reason being that the litmus test is there something more chance or skill. Like if you're playing roulette, it's obviously all chance.
Exactly.
But they determined in fantasy sports, there is luck involved, but it's more skill than luck. So the federal government said it is legal. It's not gambling. And approximately 45 states have determined it is legal, but there are still a few states that say it's not legal.
Can you name those states, those 5 states?
Off the top of my head, no. It's in the book.
Right.
Actually, I actually have to reread my own book to remember some of the details that have escaped me now.
I'm pretty sure Pennsylvania is not one of them. I'm a
I don't
PA
think so.
resident. Yeah. Yeah. And look, the whole idea of gambling and that fine line, it is something to look at. And obviously people have. I know that had I been part of that, putting money on fantasy players, I would have lost a lot of money. I was the commissioner of a fantasy football league for at least 6 years, and I always ended up at the bottom of the pile. I just like getting guys together, and I think that's the beauty of fantasy sports. It can lead to like social connection and guys connecting, watching games, and discussing through text chains about their players. And I think that's the beauty of fantasy sports.
What you just said is really important.
Mhm.
And when I started, the book, I had absolutely no idea that what you just said was going to end up being like one of the major themes of the whole book, that fantasy sports brings people together.
Yes.
You got people from high school or college have been playing in the same league for 30, 40, 50 years. And without that, they would have drifted apart over the years. You got parents playing with children. You got, parents playing with, like a 10-year-old child. There's a story about this kid was almost 10 years old and he wanted to play in his dad's fantasy football league. There were 24 teams of adults. So his dad said, well, the entry fee is $150. If you can get $150, we'll let you in the league. The kid was 2 months shy of his 10th birthday.
Right.
His parents lied to the local newspaper company, told them that he was 10 years old, so he'd be eligible to get a paper route.
Wow.
So he delivered newspapers, made $150, entered the league. He's now 10 years old, and there are 23 adults, and he won. He beat them all.
Wow.
You know,
What a
and you get,
lesson of hard work.
yeah, you got a football draft in Las Vegas. You got a plumber sitting next to the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and they're talking like they're best buddies. It just the relationship building,
Yeah.
it is just amazing.
Yeah. Building community is essential, especially when it comes to sports. And I want to ask you about the future of fantasy sports. So, where do you see fantasy sports going over the next decade? Will AI, advanced analytics, or just new technology, do you think it will change the experience?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think it'll change the experience. I don't know, but like, if you asked me 5 years ago or 10 years ago, where would we be today? I mean, I couldn't have told you. So
What do you hope readers will remember the most after they finish reading the history of fantasy sports?
I think how great it is. People love it. And for the reason we just mentioned about, relationship building, it brings coworkers together and, there's just so many interesting stories. You don't have to play fantasy sports to like the book because it's not about how to play. It's about all these stories of the people, what they did. And so, a lot of people have read the book that never played fantasy sports and, the stories are still great.
Well, I will surely make sure that the link to your book, where to find it, will be in the description for the episode that we're currently recording. What I want to do right now is, Larry, I want to go into a room where there's a box. And in that box, we have some famous NBA duos. And we call this the comparison box. Now, in each box are players, and some of these players, their relationship can be rivals, they can be teammates, they can be mentor to mentee. And the goal of this is not necessarily to say which duo is better. Instead, it's which one stands out to you for whatever reason that you come up with. So, you all set, Larry?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. The first duo is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, and Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. Which one stands out to you?
All right. Jabbar and Magic for sure. Now I got to tell you a little story. Okay. I, I'm not as big a basketball fan now as I used to be. I watch it a little bit, especially like some of the playoffs. But I used to be a big basketball fan. I lived in Boston for a long time. I went to Celtics games.
Mm-hmm.
I played fantasy basketball for a while. So I saw Magic and Kareem play at Boston Garden I guess it was probably the 80s. And I saw, McHale, Bird, Parrish, Danny Ainge, those things. So I saw some great games, great playoff games. So definitely I'll go with Magic and Kareem. But I want to tell you a little story about this time period because I know you're a Philly guy, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The thing that stands out to me the most in my memory of going to games at Boston Garden was the the 76ers and Celtics were playing I guess the Eastern Conference Finals. And let me say, I gotta get this right. there was there was a game 5 at Boston Garden, and the Sixers were up 3-1 in the series. And by the end of the fourth quarter, the Celtics had a big lead. It was obvious they're going to win the game to make it 3-2, forcing a game 6 in Philly. That would have been was going to be on Friday night. And then if the Celtics could win that game 7 would be back at the Garden on Sunday. So near the end of the game, the last couple of minutes, the crowd started chanting, "See you Sunday, see you Sunday, see you Sunday." And sure enough, the Celtics won game 6 in Philly. So then I'm back at Boston Garden for game 7 on Sunday. And the teams are out there, they're shoot around, and the crowd is going crazy. And I think everybody was confident, including me, was confident we were going to win this game. And I'm pretty sure it was Billy Cunningham was the coach of the Sixers.
Mm-hmm.
And during the shoot around, with the crowd going crazy, Cunningham does something completely unusual. He pulls his team off the court and back into the locker room to avoid that atmosphere.
Mm.
And that to me was kind of like, my God, that was probably a brilliant move. And the Sixers won that game 7 on the road at Boston.
Yes. Yeah, I remember that because then the Celtics fans, even though they despise the Sixers, they were chanting "Beat LA, beat LA."
Yep.
I remember that.
I forgot that part of it.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Speaking of the Celtics, which duo stands out to you more, Moses and Dr. J, or Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce?
Well, it's really close. I'd have to say just Moses and Dr. J. I think a little, greater. Even though I'm a Celtics guy, I think they're probably greater players. But
Yeah, I could see that. And the historical parallel would be the Celtics had struggled to make deep runs in the playoffs with Paul Pierce. It took a player like Kevin Garnett to get them over the hump. And then the same thing happened with the Sixers with Moses and Dr. J. But okay, you go with the Sixers. How about this duo? Isaiah Thomas and Michael Jordan, or Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant?
the first one, Michael, Isaiah, just because that's when I was a little bit more into watching basketball. They're great.
Little tough rivalry there.
Yeah.
Do you think they'll ever bury the hatchet and make up and be good buddies again?
Well, if they haven't done it by now, probably not.
Yeah.
It's happened
Yes.
already.
Some real bad blood between those two going back to the 80s. How about this? I'm sure you remember these duos. We have David Robinson, Tim Duncan, or Ralph Sampson and Akeem Olajuwon.
Well, I'll go with Olajuwon just because of this. That reminds me of one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in the NBA, to me, is Olajuwon fasting during Ramadan and playing NBA level basketball. I mean, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, his religious beliefs are well noted and documented in that game. I don't remember. I think it was during a playoff series, wasn't it?
Well, it was like all the time. Like Ramadan lasts, I think, for a month or something.
Right.
So sometimes, I mean, I don't know for sure, but sometimes it was, part of the regular season, maybe part of the playoffs. But it was I think it's a whole month, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Akeem Olajuwon being able to make that sacrifice for his Muslim beliefs stands out.
And play and still play at the level that he played.
Yeah. Amazing player, 2-time champion, former MVP. How about this one? Magic and Bird, or Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell? Who stands out more?
Boy, can't, how can you choose between that? Now, I'll go with Magic and Bird because I saw them play, but I mean, you can't choose that.
Okay. Any favorite Magic Bird rivalry tales? Any stories or plays stand out to you?
No, I don't. I saw them play against each other, but I don't remember anything specific.
All right. We have arguably the greatest player of all time and the greatest shooter of all time, LeBron and Steph Curry, or Kobe Bryant and Allen Iverson. Which duo stands out?
Well, I'll pick Kobe and Iverson just because I don't like LeBron's attitude sometimes.
Okay, that's fair. All right. How about Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley. Which duo stands out?
I'll go with Kobe over Charles, but you're like making very tough comparisons. We can't go wrong either way.
All right. Let's do this one. Which duo stands out? Pippen and Jordan or Kobe and Shaq?
Well, I take Shaq just because there's a little story about Shaq in my book, which is there was a Shaq, one of the first fantasy basketball contests was sponsored. They had Shaq as a spokesperson or whatever you call it. And the rules of this fantasy basketball contest was something like you could pick any two forwards you want. You could pick any two guards you want. Your center had to be Shaq.
Okay.
Shaq had to be
for obvious reasons. Rebounds, blocks, right?
Yeah, can I tell you another quick little story here?
Yeah.
This is from the book. I just want to make sure I get this in on your here. So the guy I mentioned before, Paul Charchian, he had the first weekly fantasy football magazine, and he ran it out of his apartment. So the address listed in the magazine was apartment. One day, there's a knock on his door. Guy says, "Hey, my name's Rick. I love your magazine, and I was going to subscribe to it, and I noticed the address is right here. I live in this building. I live downstairs." And he said, "Also, could I write for you? I'd really like to be involved with this. Could I write? I'll even write for free." So Charchian hired the guy, paid him a very small amount of money, and he was writing for him. And then later, Charchian was able to bring him on full time. And this guy, Rick, had a full-time job at American Express, but he took a big pay cut to write for Charchian's magazine because he hated his job at American Express. So he's writing fantasy football. Then he started writing for fantasy basketball.
Okay.
And this guy, Rick, is Rick Kamla. And that's how Kamla got into fantasy writing, which led to his whole career in, NBA broadcasting and whatnot.
Wow. That's such a great story.
Yeah.
Along with dozens of other stories, the World War II hero, the man who survived 9/11 and made it big in fantasy sports. And listen, if you love fantasy sports or if you don't love fantasy sports and you're just a sports fan and want a good read, please check out Larry's book, The History of Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen. Larry, please tell everyone where they can find your book, any websites, any social media. Please go ahead and give yourself a blast.
Well, most booksellers online have it. Some have it in their store, but everybody has it online. The best place to find out about it is if you go to Amazon, you can see all the reviews and you can see details of what's in the book. Other places have the book, but they don't have as many reviews or details.
Well, I'll make sure that Amazon link gets in the description for our podcast episode. And that being said, we are in currently season 4 prep mode. This summer, we're going to be looking at all the comparisons that we're going to give all of our followers and fans. And we just did a recent interview, Larry, with a former NBA player, Keith Kloss, who is doing big things in Costa Rica with his basketball academy. So you can expect that interview coming out along with Larry's. On behalf of Larry Schechter, I'm Uriah Young with NBA Now and Then. Thanks for listening, guys.